Welcome to the Way to Be Human podcast. This is a safe space where we embrace the messiness of life, dive into honest conversations about mental health, and talk about what it really means to be human. I have been saying for years now that I've wanted to do a mental health-based podcast, and I left that sigh in intentionally because I have been constantly getting in my own way, just even starting this podcast. For example, I have, for the last several months, been trying to record this episode that you're hearing right now, and it's taken me multiple times of re-recording, to the extent that almost every session I feel like I was re-recording at least 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 times, and then having to take a break because I'm just like, why do I keep re-recording? So it feels like it's been a million times now that I've re-recorded this, but I feel optimistic that what you're hearing now is what I'm going to publish. And with that being said, I want to have a topic for this episode. I originally was not going to, but as I reflect on my own journey to recording and starting this podcast, I think it's really important to talk about how perfectionism has really impacted my experience with starting this podcast. I think the biggest roadblock for me is that I expect things to be perfect, and that goes for this podcast. So as I've been trying to record and edit and start it up, I just have this, what feels like an irrational thought that like everything needs to be perfect. The sound quality has to be perfect, the recording is perfect, the editing is perfect, the cover art, the title, the description, everything just has to be perfect. And it's really funny that this is how my brain thinks, because at the same time I also have this strong belief that nothing is perfect, that perfection doesn't really exist, because at the end of the day, like, we're humans and there's a beauty to us being imperfect, and there's a beauty to life being imperfect. So it's very fascinating as I reflect on all of this that I have been so deterred from moving this podcast forward because of this just level of perfectionism that I've been experiencing. So I think this episode is going to be a good reminder that I moved past it and I can let it go and move forward, and that I'm giving myself permission to not have something that's perfect. And I think I would also add to that, starting this podcast and recording it has really felt like a big, hard thing. And I'm realizing that I can do the tough, difficult, hard things in life. And I think this is a great example and a great reminder that I can do it, and you can also do it. So if there's something that is stopping you from doing something that you want to do that seems scary and tough, just know you can do it. And once you do it, it's not as scary and tough as you originally thought it would be. And now I feel like I can breathe. So there's another sigh, allowing myself to take a nice deep breath because I have now given myself permission to let go and move past the perfectionism. And I think this brings us into a good place to talk about why I wanted to create Way to Be Human. The main reason is because there is a phrase that my therapist says that stuck with me, and the phrase was, way to be human. And it's that validation of our emotional experiences that really inspired me to want to create a podcast, because ultimately I want this podcast to be a validation of our lived emotional experiences, because that's what makes us human. We are so unique in the sense that we get to experience these emotions, we get to experience perspectives, and we take on life with such a unique perspective that if you think about animals, they may not necessarily experience life in the same way that we do. And obviously there's a lot about animals that we don't know. I'm not going to get into all of that, but just a general example. And not only do I want this podcast to be a validation of our lived emotional experiences and a safe space for us to talk about it, but I have also always lived my life authentically and vulnerably, and there is nothing more authentic and vulnerable, to me at least, than creating a mental health based podcast where I am openly and honestly sharing about myself and my life, with the hope being that that is helping others to feel seen and heard. So this is going to be I think an intense podcast, and I think that's okay. As long as we are making sure that we're creating this safe space to have those tough discussions, then I think it'll be all right. And I look forward to talking more about just my own mental health journey and just some of the things I've gone through in life and what I've learned. And maybe it's something that resonates with you, or maybe it doesn't, and that's okay too. So the main reason that I wanted to do this intro episode is to go over the disclaimers and ground rules. So starting with the first one, this is more of a disclaimer, but the sound quality and editing. So you can probably tell that I am clearly not a professional when it comes to recording a podcast and editing a podcast. There are audio engineers and editors out there who, spend their careers doing this, and that is not me. So I apologize up front if the sound quality is rough, if the editing is interesting, because that's what I expect it to be. It just is what it is for right now, so just bear with me as I learn and improve and get better at doing this. Another disclaimer, I am a really big fan of swearing, so this podcast is going to be filled with expletives, and it just is what it is too. So if you want to listen to this, I would recommend not listening to it around anyone who is sensitive to swearing. Just because there's nothing better than a good swear word. And another disclaimer, I am doing my best to have this podcast be unscripted because I really want this to be authentic. I want this to feel like kind of like a stream of thoughts. Maybe like a diary journal where I am just essentially word vomiting. And to me, that feels like the most authentic way that I could have a podcast. So that may change in the future. It may become more scripted if I get to the point where I have guests or, there's like a tough topic that I want to talk through. But I just think you can hear and feel the difference between something that's scripted and unscripted. And for now, I'm making the executive decision that I want this to be truly authentic to me. So it'll be unscripted, which might mean there are some awkward areas, awkward phrases, awkward who knows, in this podcast, which me going through all the things that could be awkward was probably an awkward statement in and of itself, but here we are. Now, this is more of a ground rule for the next thing I'm going to get into, but this is a safe space. So, with that, this has to be a space where we can have those honest and difficult conversations. There's no ifs, ands, or buts about it. This is a safe space. And we all have to be okay with that, and we all have to respect that and understand that. Additionally, I may also get things wrong. So this is kind of giving myself permission to acknowledge that, like, I'm not always going to get things right. And I think this is the part of life where it truly is a journey about learning and doing better. So I'm open to feedback, just as long as the feedback is going to be direct, polite, and respectful. Don't be an asshole. There's too many assholes in the world. We don't need any more. But I'm open to receiving feedback to do better and be better, as long as you're providing me that feedback in the way I just described. And finally, this is a ground rule as well. The last one, I promise. What I talk about in this podcast is only from my perspective. I am hesitant to say that any of this is advice because what's worked for me might not work for you. And I think there's a very thin line between advice and opinion. And I'm trying to be very careful in what I say. And I'm not sure how great of a job I'm doing, so you're able to provide me, you're welcome to provide me feedback on that even in this intro episode. But I just want to be very careful that, like, what I'm talking about is simply just coming from what I have experienced, what I know, and that might not be applicable to the majority of people. So just something that I want folks to be aware of as you're listening to this podcast and as we get into more topics. So with all of that being said, at this exact moment in time, I'm not totally sure which way this podcast is going to go, or really any way that this podcast is going to go. But I think that creates an opportunity for you as the listener to help shape it. So just as I want to hear feedback, I also want to hear from you. What topics should we dive into? You can email me at waytobehuman@gmail.com, and let's build this together. Thank you for listening, and remember, way to be human.